5 weddings, 5 grooms, 5 nights of horror that no one in town ever forgot. The Crowley sisters looked like perfect brides, devout, graceful, and pure. But behind their lace veils lurked something unspeakable. On every wedding night, their new husbands met a fate too gruesome to imagine. Was it madness, a curse, or something far darker? Stay with us as we uncover the vicious tale of the Crowley sisters and the nightmare that turned love into mutilation. Long before the Crowley sisters became a whispered legend of terror, they were simply 4 girls growing up in a household that reeked of iron discipline and unspoken fear. Their childhood home, a weather-beaten farmhouse on the edge of town, stood like a fortress of secrets. Curtains rarely opened. Doors creaked, but seldom welcomed. And inside those dimly lit rooms, silence was a rule, not a choice. Their father, Reverend Silas Crowley, was the kind of man whose presence filled every corner like a shadow. He preached fire and brimstone sermons to his congregation each Sunday, demanding obedience, purity, and fear of eternal damnation. But what he delivered in church was nothing compared to what he enforced at home. For the Crowley girls, their father was not a shepherd of souls. He was a warden. Dinner was eaten in silence, punctuated only by the sound of cutlery against chipped plates. If one of the girls spoke out of turn, Reverend Crowley's hand would strike the table, or worse, strike them. Their mother, Margaret, sat quietly beside him, eyes cast downward, never daring to meet her daughter's gaze. She had learned long ago that resistance only brought pain. The sisters grew up under the constant weight of rules. They were forbidden from speaking to boys, forbidden from laughing too loudly, forbidden from reading anything that wasn't scripture. Each night, their father would remind them of Eve's sin, repeating that women were temptresses, destroyers of men, and that their only worth lay in submission to a husband. The lesson carved into them from childhood was simple. Men ruled. Women obeyed but behind closed doors. In whispered conversations when their father's footsteps faded, the sisters shared their anger. They spoke in hushed tones about the injustice of their lives, about the way their mother's spirit had been broken into silence, about the way their father's sermons felt like chains. Those conversations planted seeds of resentment that would grow wild in their hearts. Dottie was the eldest, Catherine, who first began to speak of freedom. She was sharp-eyed, clever, and already carrying the bitterness of years of repression. One day, she whispered to her sisters, "We will not bow to men. One day, we will be the ones who hold the power." Her words, though soft, burned like a spark in the dark. The middle sisters, Eleanor and Ruth, clung to Catherine's defiance like lifelines. They had suffered enough under their father's hand to know she was right. If their lives were to mean anything, it would be by defying the very structure he had forced upon them. And then there was the youngest, Mary, still a child when these whispers began. She listened, wide-eyed, torn between fear of God's wrath and awe at her sister's courage. Over time, these secret vows of rebellion became a bond stronger than any chain their father could lay upon them. What began as resentment grew into something darker, a twisted sisterhood founded on defiance and secrecy. They began to believe that men were not leaders, but enemies. They came to see marriage not as salvation, but as a trap. When their father finally died, the sisters did not weep. The congregation remembered Reverend Crowley as a stern but righteous man. His daughters, however, remembered only the sting of his punishments and the endless weight of his rules. They buried him with bowed heads, but their hearts carried not grief, only grim satisfaction. For the first time, they were free of him, yet the freedom came too late to heal the wounds he had left. The Crowley sisters were shaped by fear, sharpened by rage, and bound by a vow whispered in childhood, never to let a man rule over them. To outsiders, they appeared as modest, pious young women ready to step into society, ready to become wives. But within them, The seeds of vengeance had already taken root, and those seeds would soon bloom in blood. When Catherine Crowley, the eldest of the sisters, finally announced her engagement, the town rejoiced. After years of whispers about the reclusive family, this marriage was a sign of normalcy, of hope. Catherine was 21, striking in her pale beauty, with eyes that held both intelligence and mystery. Her groom, Thomas Hawley, was a respected young farmer from a neighboring county. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and well-liked by everyone who knew him. The courtship had been brief, almost suspiciously so. Thomas was smitten, enchanted by Catherine's grace and poise, and he wasted no time in securing her hand. To the townsfolk, it seemed a blessing, a union that would finally bring the Crowley family into the light of respectability. For Catherine, however, it was not love that drove her to the altar. It was something colder, darker in opportunity. The wedding day arrived on a crisp autumn morning. The church bells rang loud and clear, echoing through the valley. Guests filled the pews, whispering about how radiant Catherine looked in her ivory gown, her veil falling in delicate lace around her face. Her sisters sat together in the front row, dressed in modest dresses, their eyes unreadable. The ceremony was perfect. Vows were exchanged, hands were bound, and the congregation sang hymns of joy. When Catherine and Thomas walked down the aisle together, the people clapped and cheered, believing they were witnessing the start of a happy life. The reception was simple, but warm tables laden with roasted meats, bread, and cider, laughter spilling into the air. To everyone else, the day was a picture of bliss. But Catherine's smile, though flawless, was hollow. Behind her veil of serenity, she carried the memory of every sermon her father had ever shouted, every night her mother had wept in silence. She carried the vow she and her sisters had whispered in the shadows, never to bow, never to be owned. Night fell, and the newlyweds retired to the bridal chamber. It was a small room, lit only by a single oil lamp. The bed was draped in fresh linens, the scent of lavender hanging in the air. Thomas, still glowing from the excitement of the day, reached for his new bride with tenderness. He believed he had married a gentle, pious woman. He could not have known that Catherine's heart beat not with love, but with vengeance. What happened next would never be spoken of in detail, not by Catherine, not by her sisters, and certainly not by the town. All that is known is this: by morning, Thomas Hawley was dead. His body was discovered lifeless in the marriage bed, mutilated in a way that made strong men turn pale. His manhood had been taken from him, destroyed in the most brutal fashion. The sheets were soaked in blood. The town reeled in shock. The official story, whispered by the doctor, was that Thomas had suffered some terrible accident, a seizure perhaps, or a sudden illness. But the whispers among the women were different. They had seen Catherine's calm face at the funeral, her dry eyes behind a black veil. They had seen the way her sisters stood close by, their hands clasped tightly together, as if sharing a secret. Rumors spread quickly. Some said Catherine had been cursed, that her husband had fallen victim to divine punishment. Others claimed the Crowley bloodline carried some dark affliction that doomed their men. But no one dared to accuse her directly. Catherine was young, beautiful, and a widow now. To question her was to invite scandal, and scandal was something the town preferred to bury Dot in the weeks that followed. Catherine played her role flawlessly. She wore black, attended church, and lowered her gaze whenever spoken to. She looked every bit the grieving widow, yet there was something unsettling in the way she carried herself. Not grief, not sorrow, but something sharper, something colder. Dot, her sisters watched closely, their eyes bright with unspoken understanding. Catherine had set the precedent. She had proven that a man could be conquered, not with meekness, but with blood. And she had done it without consequence. The whispers of their childhood vow echoed louder than ever. Never bow, never be owned. By spring, Catherine was once again the subject of whispers, not of suspicion, but of fascination. Men spoke of her beauty in hushed tones, drawn to her despite the dark cloud that hung over her. Some believed her cursed, yet still they desired her. Others believed she was merely unlucky, a victim of cruel fate. No one, not even the bravest, dared to suggest the truth, that Catherine had chosen this path, and that she would not walk it alone. In the quiet of their home, the sisters gathered, their bond stronger than ever. One marriage, one death, one bloody secret. It would not be the last. In the days that followed Thomas Hale's death, the Crowley sisters gathered in the quiet of their farmhouse, away from prying eyes. The world saw them as grieving family, bound together by sorrow. But the sisters themselves were bound by something far darker, a secret oath, a pact that would shape the rest of their lives. It was Catherine who first spoke. She had seen the power they could wield, the terror they could instill, and she knew it must not be wasted. "We cannot stop here," she whispered to her siblings, her voice low and firm. "We know now it must be done. A man will never hold power over us again." Eleanor and Ruth nodded, their faces solemn but resolute. Mary, the youngest, shivered at first, unsure if the world could truly allow such darkness. But when she looked into her sister's eyes, she saw something undeniable, a unity forged in years of abuse, isolation, and fear. She saw the strength that came from controlling the one thing their father had always promised would own them, the men who sought their hands. That night, they performed what would become the first ritual of their pact. In the attic, under the slanted beams of the farmhouse roof, they gathered around a small table. Candles flickered, casting long, quivering shadows across the walls. On the table lay symbols of their oath: a folded black veil, a silver knife used for household tasks, and a small piece of parchment. On it they wrote in careful, deliberate letters the promise that would bind them forever. No man shall command, control, or claim us. We are ours alone, in life, in death, and in vengeance. Catherine cut her palm, letting a few drops of blood fall onto the parchment. One by one, the other sisters followed. The blood mingled, smearing the ink in dark crimson patterns. They pressed their hands together over the paper, sealing the promise with their lifeblood. From that moment on, the sisters were not just family. They were a unit of calculated resolve, bound by ritual, intent, and shared secrets. It was not merely revenge that guided them. It was control, power, and protection. They had been raised to fear men, to fear being owned, and now they had discovered the means to ensure that fear would never return. Each marriage was no longer a union of love or devotion. Each wedding became a stage, each groom a test of the sisters' dominance. And yet there was a method to their madness. They were careful, precise, and patient. No one outside the family could see the connection between the deaths of their husbands. They hid in plain sight, playing the role society expected of them: pious, obedient, grieving. Their neighbors believed them victims, never realizing that the sisters were orchestrating the very terror they whispered about. The ritual also served another purpose. It reinforced their loyalty to one another. Any hesitation, any act of doubt, would be met with the cold, unwavering insistence of the others. They were sisters bound by blood, bound by secrecy, and bound by an unshakable conviction. Each act of violence that followed would be less a crime and more an affirmation of their pact, a horrifying testament to the power they wielded as a single, unyielding unit. As they extinguished the candles and descended from the attic, the sisters were no longer merely women shaped by abuse. They were architects of fear, students of terror, and now practitioners of a dark art perfected over time. The world would see only their smiles, their polite nods, their soft-spoken words. But in the shadows, they had made a vow that would echo in blood across every marriage bed that lay ahead. Crowley sisters were no longer victims of circumstance. They were masters of their own horrifying destiny. The death of Thomas Halley was only the beginning. With the pact sealed and their resolve unwavering, the Crowley sisters embarked on a grim cycle that would haunt the town for years to come. Each sister, in turn, stepped into society with a carefully cultivated appearance, demure, devoted, seemingly yearning for companionship. But beneath the delicate lace and courteous smiles, the same dark promise lingered, never to be owned, never to bow, never to allow a man to dominate their lives. Eleanor, the second eldest, was the next to wed. Unlike Catherine, her courtship was measured, deliberate. She studied her prospective husband, a local carpenter named Samuel Bryce, for months. His habits, his weaknesses, his pride, all were noted and catalogued in secret. The town saw a happy match, a harmonious union of two young people who appeared perfectly suited. Only the sisters knew that the honeymoon would seal another tragedy. The wedding was as traditional as Catherine's, yet with subtle differences. Eleanor's smile was softer, her laughter gentler, but her eyes held the same sharp resolve. Samuel was charmed, completely unaware of the peril awaiting him. That night, the honeymoon suite, a small room above the inn where the town's visitors often stayed, became the stage for Eleanor's grim work. By morning, Samuel was dead, mutilated in a manner consistent with the first husband's fate. His death was explained away by the town doctor as an unfortunate accident, though rumors began to stir among those who whispered in dark corners. Not Ruth, the third sister, followed a similar path. She married Jonathan Pierce, a young man who worked the local mill. Ruth's method was subtle. She ensnared him with charm and attentiveness, creating a sense of trust and love. Yet that trust became the instrument of his downfall. The honeymoon, spent in a small cabin near the woods, ended with Jonathan's life taken in secret, his body discovered with the same horrifying mutilation as the others. Some townsfolk noticed the pattern, murmuring about the deaths of the Crowley husbands, but the sisters' careful orchestration kept suspicion at bay. Mary, the youngest, married last. Her groom, Edward Hawthorne, was well known in town as kind and gentle. He adored Mary, unaware that her innocence was a facade. The sisters guided her, trained her in the ritual, preparing her to continue the family legacy. Edward's demise mirrored the others, though Mary's hands shook the first time she carried out the act. Eleanor and Ruth were there, their presence a reminder of the pact, their cold gazes pushing her to fulfill her role. By dawn, Edward lay lifeless, the final widowhood complete. With each death, the Crowley sisters grew bolder, more confident. The pattern was now unmistakable to those who dared to notice. Every Crowley sister married, every groom died in the night, every tragedy carefully concealed behind a veneer of propriety. The town could not reconcile the beauty, the piety, and the horror. Families whispered warnings to one another, but fear of scandal kept the truth buried. The sisters themselves spoke little of the killings. Within their home, the events were discussed only in hushed tones, in the attic where the original pact had been sealed. Each death was not celebrated with joy, but acknowledged as necessary, a grim fulfillment of the vow they had made. They were careful to maintain appearances. Smiles at church, polite conversation in the market, gentle gestures to neighbors. Outsiders could not see the darkness that thrived behind the walls of the Crowley home. Over time, stories began to circulate, ghostly tales of cursed brides and grooms who never awoke from their wedding beds. Some claimed that the sisters were witches. Others whispered of a family curse, passed from generation to generation. Children dared not speak their names aloud, fearing the wrath of unseen forces. And yet the sisters moved through society unscathed, their outward appearances of innocence and virtue never betraying the horrors they orchestrated. By the time the fifth groom had perished, the sisters were legends in their own right. Not feared openly, not publicly condemned, but always spoken of in whispers. Men who sought the attention of a Crowley sister did so at their own risk, often ignoring the warning signs of the family's dark history. The sisters had created a cycle of terror so precise, so hidden in plain sight, that few could ever trace the string of tragedies back to its source. And still, the sisters were not satisfied. Each death reinforced their bond, strengthened their confidence, and deepened their commitment to the pact they had sworn in blood. They were no longer simply women shaped by cruelty. They were masters of their own destiny, wielding fear as both weapon and shield. The town would remember the pattern of deaths for decades to come, though the truth remained largely hidden in those early years. The Crowley sisters perfected their method, learning patience, discretion, and timing. The sequence of 5 husbands had become more than mere revenge. It was a statement, a grim proclamation that the Crowley women would never be controlled, and any man foolish enough to try would pay the ultimate price. The legend of 5 weddings, 5 grooms, and 5 widows had begun, and with it, the town's uneasy fascination and fear would only grow stronger with each passing year. As the years passed and the pattern of deaths became undeniable to the more observant townsfolk, the name Crowley began to carry with it a chill. Neighbors whispered behind lace curtains, glancing nervously toward the Crowley farmhouse, where the sisters lived as if untouched by the horrors they had orchestrated. Children were warned not to speak their names aloud, lest some terrible curse fall upon them. The once mundane town now pulsed with superstition and fear. The local women were the first to notice. They shared hushed warnings in kitchens and laundry rooms, exchanging glances when a new suitor approached a Crowley sister. "Mark my words," one elderly woman would say, "any man who marries into that family will meet a terrible end." Yet, despite their warnings, some men dismissed the tailies as old wives' superstition. Blinded by the allure of beauty and the promise of a Crowley bride, stories grew with each passing year. Guests at local inns reported strange happenings at the farmhouse. Windows rattling with no wind, faint sobs echoing from empty rooms, candles burning low even when untouched. Some swore they glimpsed shadows moving along walls when no one was present, or heard soft laughter at times when no one should have been awake. The sisters' reputation, carefully constructed from appearances of innocence, now wove itself into legend. The town's clergy became uneasy. Reverend Pritchard, a devout man who had known the Crowleys for decades, quietly advised his congregation to tread carefully. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he would say, avoiding specifics, "and some hearts are not as they appear." Parishioners exchanged knowing looks. They could feel the weight of the sisters' presence, even if they could not name it. Some claimed the women possessed a strange aura, a combination of beauty and menace that made men uneasy, women wary, and children silent. Merchants and tradesmen spoke more freely in the taverns, where wine loosened tongues. The pattern of husbands dying after marriage was now undeniable to them, even if they could not name the perpetrators. They theorized curses, divine wrath, or even witchcraft. Few dared speak openly to authorities, fearing scandal or disbelief, but behind closed doors, their conversations were filled with dread and fascination. The sisters were both admired and loathed, feared and envied, a paradox the town could neither fully comprehend nor resist. Even strangers who passed through the town felt the tension. Travelers who inquired about the Crowley household were met with cautious smiles, evasive answers, or outright silence. One man, a merchant from the next county, wrote home to his wife that the Crowleys carry a shadow with them, a darkness that hangs in the air and chills the very bones. Such letters spread quietly, adding layers to the growing legend. The sisters themselves nurtured the unease, though subtly. They wore black veils at funerals, long after mourning periods ended. They lingered in the shadows of church gatherings, eyes glinting with unspoken knowledge. Occasionally, they would speak in whispers to one another, the meaning unintelligible to outsiders, yet enough to make observers feel a shiver down their spine. Even their laughter, soft and melodious, carried an edge that seemed unnatural, almost dangerous. Rumors now flourished like wild vines. Some claimed the sisters had made a pact with the devil, trading their souls for power over men. Others whispered that they performed secret rituals in the dead of night, binding the life force of their husbands to their own. Children told tales of ghostly brides wandering the hills at dusk, searching for their next victim. And though no one could prove it, everyone in town began to watch the Crowleys with a wary eye, recognizing that evil, or something dangerously close to it, lived behind the farmhouse walls. In this way, the sisters' legend grew. Fear became a living entity, feeding on every whispered conversation, every suspicious glance, every uneasy footstep in the village streets. The town itself seemed to bend beneath the weight of unease, and the Crowley sisters thrived in the shadows, invisible in plain sight, untouchable yet omnipresent. And so the people learned, without ever needing to say it aloud, to cross a Crowley sister was to invite disaster, to admire her beauty was to risk your life, and to enter her home was to step into a world where terror and charm were inseparable. Mary Crowley, the youngest of the sisters, had always been different. She had listened to the whispered oaths and plans of her older sisters with a mixture of awe and unease. She had witnessed the deaths of the 5 husbands and the quiet, unwavering resolve of Catherine, Eleanor, and Ruth. While they seemed to draw strength from their ritual, from their pact of blood and vengeance, Mary began to feel the stirrings of doubt, a gnawing unease that would not be silenced. It began quietly, in dreams. She would see the faces of the husbands she had helped destroy, their eyes wide with terror, silently asking why. She would wake in the cold hours of the night, drenched in sweat, her hands trembling as she recalled her own participation. The pact that once seemed like a shield now felt like a cage, confining her to a path she feared but could not escape. Mary tried to speak to her sisters, to voice her uncertainty, but the words never came. Eleanor and Ruth, always sharp-eyed and unwavering, noticed the flicker of hesitation in her gaze. Catherine, the eldest, was less forgiving. "We are bound by blood, Mary," she said one evening, her voice cold as winter stone. "There is no room for weakness. We protect one another, and we protect ourselves. Do not let doubt betray you now." Even so, Mary could not silence the questions that plagued her mind. Was this vengeance, or was it cruelty? Were they defending themselves, or had they crossed into something far darker than any childhood abuse could justify? The youngest sister felt a strange pull, a desire to honor the pact, to remain loyal to her sisters, and yet a growing fear that their actions were unnatural, inhuman. Her hesitation did not go unnoticed. The sisters' eyes, so familiar and so piercing, seemed to see straight into her soul. On more than one occasion, Mary caught herself thinking that if she faltered, even for a moment, the consequences could be dire. Not just for herself, but for the carefully constructed order of their pact. She had been raised to obey, but now she was forced to confront the moral weight of her own hands. In the quiet moments of the day, Mary would wander to the edges of the family's land, staring at the rolling hills and the dark forests beyond, wondering what life could have been if she had been allowed innocence, if she had never been bound to her sister's dark legacy. The wind through the trees whispered possibilities she could never seize, haunting her with freedom she could only imagine. And yet, the pull of the sisterhood was stronger than her guilt. When the time came for her to fulfill her role in the pact, she obeyed, though her hands shook and her breath came in quick, sharp gasps. Each act of violence left her more hollow, but also more tightly bound to the others. Mary's doubt became a secret she could never share, a shadow that haunted her every step. Her internal struggle added tension to the sisters, otherwise unbroken chain of control. Catherine, Eleanor, and Ruth remained steadfast, but Mary's fear was a reminder that even the most meticulous plans could fray at the edges. The youngest sister's conscience was a flickering candle, threatening to expose the darkness that had thrived in silence for so long. Mary's doubt was the first crack in an otherwise flawless pattern, a glimmer of humanity in a lineage of terror. And though she hid it well, the seeds of potential betrayal had been sown, waiting silently for the day they might grow into a reckoning. The quiet town that had long whispered about the Crowley sisters began to stir with more than superstition. The pattern of husbands dying under mysterious circumstances could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. 5 young men, 5 grooms, had all perished shortly after marriage, and the similarities in their deaths were too glaring to ignore. Those who had once whispered rumors in dark corners now began to take action, albeit cautiously, for fear of scandal or disbelief. It began with Dr. Benjamin Harlow, the local physician who had attended the funerals of the 5 grooms. A man of sharp mind and keen observation, he had noted the similarities, the timing of the deaths, the unexplained injuries, and the subtle signs that something unnatural had occurred. The first 2 deaths he had dismissed as tragic accidents, but as the 3rd and 4th followed the same pattern, doubt began to gnaw at him. By the time Edward Hawthorne's death was reported, he could no longer ignore the truth that Dr. Harlow approached Sheriff Daniel Price, a man of integrity but prone to skepticism. "Something is very wrong with the Crowley family," he said quietly in the sheriff's office, glancing over his shoulder to ensure no one overheard. "These men, they did not die naturally. There is evidence subtle but consistent, and the deaths always follow the same sequence: a marriage, a night, a body. I fear the worst." Sheriff Price, uneasy, agreed to investigate, though he knew the task would be perilous. The sisters were well regarded publicly, their appearances of innocence flawless. Accusing them without proof could ruin his career, and worse, the women themselves seemed untouchable. Yet the pattern was undeniable, and the fear gripping the town demanded action. The investigation began subtly. Dr. Harlow examined funeral records, spoke discreetly with townsfolk, and collected testimony about the weddings and the bride's behavior. Sheriff Price questioned neighbors, innkeepers, and anyone who had attended the weddings or seen the newlyweds. Patterns emerged. The grooms had been isolated during their honeymoons. Each bride had maintained strict control over access to their rooms, and in each case, signs of struggle were observed, but never conclusively documented. Despite the growing evidence, the sisters remained outwardly composed. Catherine, Eleanor, Ruth, and Mary continued their routines, attending church, visiting markets, and performing small acts of charity to maintain their public image. Their calm and beauty disarmed any casual observer, making suspicion seem irrational. It was only through persistent investigation and careful cross-examination that Dr. Harlow and Sheriff Price began to piece together the horrifying truth. Tensions within the sisters also began to rise. Mary's doubt, long suppressed, grew heavier under the scrutiny of outsiders. For the first time, she feared that their pact might fail not through punishment, but because human curiosity had finally pierced their carefully constructed veil of secrecy. The other sisters noticed her hesitation, their sharp eyes warning her that any misstep could lead to exposure. They reinforced their bond, reminding one another that loyalty and silence were paramount. Finally, small but damning pieces of evidence came to light: garments with traces of blood, witnesses who had seen unusual behaviors during weddings, and letters written in fear by townsfolk who had once admired the sisters. Though circumstantial, the accumulation of proof was enough to push the investigation forward. Dr. Harlow and Sheriff Price confronted the Crowleys, demanding explanations. Catherine met them with unshaken calm, a faint, almost chilling smile playing on her lips. "I do not understand what you mean," she said softly, her eyes betraying nothing. Eleanor and Ruth remained close behind her, hands clasped, unwavering, while Mary's gaze flickered nervously between the sisters and the men confronting them. The town itself seemed to hold its breath. Gossip had transformed into suspicion, and suspicion into fear. The once quiet Crowley farmhouse was now under the scrutiny of men determined to unearth the truth. Every shadow became a witness, every whispered conversation a potential confession. Though the sisters had maintained their deadly secrets for years, the investigation revealed that even the most meticulous plans could unravel when faced with persistent scrutiny and human curiosity. The cracks in their fortress of secrecy were widening, threatening to expose a darkness that had been carefully hidden for so long that, by the end of the confrontation, the sisters realized that the game they had played with life and death had reached a turning point. The veil of control they had so carefully maintained could no longer shield them entirely. The town was awakening, and the Crowley sisters, once untouchable, now faced a reckoning whose outcome could be punishment, disgrace, or something even more chilling. The Crowley sisters had ruled in secret for years, but the investigation had torn at the edges of their carefully constructed world. The town, once fearful and silent, now demanded answers. Dr. Harlow and Sheriff Price had gathered enough evidence to confront the sisters with the full weight of suspicion, and the air was thick with tension. Every step the women took toward the courthouse, every glance they exchanged, seemed to carry the weight of decades of secrets. One path led to justice, cold and unyielding. If the town's authorities had their way, the sisters would be arrested, tried, and punished for their crimes. Crowds would gather to watch them face the law, the final act of a saga that had begun in whispered childhood vows and ended in horror. Catherine, Eleanor, Ruth, and Mary would stand side by side, the fear of their own mortality mingling with the same cold resolve that had driven them for years. The verdict, if conviction followed, would cement their names in history, not as innocent daughters of a strict household, but as the brides of death, the women who turned marriage into nightmare. Yet there was another possibility, one that left the town trembling long after the last whispers died down. On the eve of their supposed arrest, some claimed the sisters vanished. The farmhouse stood abandoned, doors creaking in the wind, rocking chairs swaying as if moved by invisible hands. Bridal gowns hung stiffly in the attic, untouched, while the fire in the hearth had burned low to ash. No footprints marked the ground outside, no carriage tracks indicated departure. It was as though the Crowley sisters had simply dissolved into the shadows from which they had emerged, leaving the town to grapple with fear, uncertainty, and legend. The townsfolk debated which fate was more horrifying. Some preferred the thought of justice served, imagining the sisters behind bars, finally powerless. Others feared the alternative, that the women had escaped, their power and menace intact, ready to continue their grim legacy elsewhere. Whispers persisted of strange women seen in nearby towns, eerily familiar, with faces pale and veiled, drawing attention and curiosity wherever they went. For Mary, the youngest, the question of fate was personal. She had carried the weight of guilt for years, and even if she escaped, she knew the shadows of her conscience would follow. Catherine, Eleanor, and Ruth, unwavering to the last, seemed almost impervious, as if the law itself were powerless against them. Whether imprisoned or vanished, their legend had achieved its immortality. In either ending, the town would never be the same. The Crowley sisters had instilled a pervasive fear that lingered in the air long after their immediate presence. Children grew up hearing stories of brides who brought death with them, husbands who vanished into legend, and a family whose name was whispered in dread. Even those who had never seen the sisters felt the cold brush of their legacy, as though the shadow of the farmhouse stretched beyond its walls, touching every corner of the valley. And so the story closed, not with comfort, but with unease. 5 husbands, 5 brides, 5 nights of horror, and a legacy that refused to die. The Crowley Sisters, whether facing the gavel or dissolving into legend, had ensured that their tale would haunt the town forever. For those who dared to ponder their fate, the question remained: had justice been done, or did the Crowleys simply disappear, leaving terror to roam free, waiting for the next unsuspecting victim? The answer, like the sisters themselves, remains shrouded in shadow.